It was the year 2016 when NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick would spark a movement by performing one simple gesture. He decided to kneel instead of stand during the national anthem before each of his games. After the demonstration was noticed, the media sprung into action to get an explanation as to why he was kneeling. Kaepernick remarked that kneeling during the anthem was his personal way of protesting racial inequality and specifically the police brutality taking place all over the country. As time passed and the movement grew, those in opposition of the protests began to shift the narrative in order to stifle the voice of the oppressed. Insults were hurled at kneeling players for disrespecting the flag of the United States of America. Others engaged in massive rants about veterans being dishonored through the disrespectful gesture. Some went as far as to say that Kaepernick was protesting the anthem itself. Social media quarrels and debates ensued over the little-known third verse in the song mentioning slaves. President Donald Trump called for team owners to fire players that refused to honor the flag. Pandemonium hit the NFL and mass confusion began to run wild. In response to Trump, players, coaches, and even some owners decided to join the protest en masse. This only served to water down the original intent of the protest. Some kneeled, some sat, some stood, and some linked arms in a vague demonstration of solidarity. Solidarity against what and for what was never quite explained, and ultimately the fans booed players, coaches, and owners alike. However, some of us have not forgotten the original intent of Kaepernick's protest. This is not about the nation's flag, anthem versus veterans, or even Donald Trump. Some of us are not moved by owners, coaches, and coons kneeling any more than we would be moved by a slave owner working in a field with his own slaves. Even some Kaepernick sympathizers have falsely made it about free speech and a person being able to stand up for their own beliefs and opinions, right or wrong. This is not about opinions and beliefs, though. This is about facts. It is a fact that in February of 2016, Seattle police officers gunned down a black man by the name of Shay Taylor, claiming that he was unresponsive to their commands and attempted to reach for his gun. From the video footage, all we can see is Taylor doing as the officers commanded him to do. As far as the gun Taylor was allegedly carrying, no fingerprints from him could be found on the firearm. Furthermore, none of Taylor's DNA could be found on the gun, magazine, or even the bullets. How does a man that sheds over 400,000 skin cells a day manage to keep the needed 70 to 150 cells for a positive match off of his gun? Not to mention the DNA that could be transferred from sweat or even breathing on the object. In fact, the gun had an ownership history of belonging to a former police officer. It doesn't take a genius to figure out it is more plausible that a gun with absolutely no DNA on it from Taylor was never in his possession. The idea that he was armed with that gun during the shooting is ludicrous, and yet no cops were brought up on charges or even fired. It is a fact, not an opinion, that an officer in Olympia, Washington shot two young men by the names of Andre and Bryson. It is a fact, not an opinion, that 3 of the 5 members of the shooting review board were employees of the Olympia Police Department. Please, somebody tell us how that is not a conflict of interest. The officer repeatedly said he was in fear for his life. But if he was so afraid, why didn't he turn on his light bar with the flashing lights during the incident? If he was so afraid, why didn't he wait for backup to arrive? After all, the suspects posed no threat to the community. If he was so afraid, why did he pursue the young men after the scuffle he claimed to have with them? There was a K-9 unit on the way. The officer claimed that Bryson attacked him. If this is true, how did the bullet wounds end up in Bryson's back? Did Bryson attack the officer with his back to him? Lastly, if there was a scuffle, how come there was no DNA found on the officer's uniform from the young men? It is more plausible based on the evidence that there was never a scuffle and that the officer gunned Bryson down while he was fleeing the officer. Once again, no one from OPD was brought up on charges and no one was fired. Bryson is still paralyzed to this day from the bullet in his spine, and the public simply moves on to the next piece of sensational news like the death of Harambe or Donald Trump's latest tweet. Yet there are families still picking up the broken pieces of their lives that have been shattered due to police brutality and a corrupt justice system. It is a fact, not an opinion, that Terrence Crutcher was shot and killed by a police officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was unarmed and was simply waiting on his family to arrive to help him because his SUV had stalled in the middle of the street. Law enforcement claimed that he had attempted to reach inside of his car window to grab something, and so they shot him. However, it has been confirmed that Crutcher's window was actually rolled up. Was the officer jailed? No. She was found not guilty on all charges. It is a fact, not a belief, that according to the Washington Post in 2016, 34% of unarmed people killed by police officers were black males, yet they only make up 6% of the population. The list goes on and on. This is what Colin Kaepernick was protesting, and those of us that stand with him couldn't care less about the national anthem's words. We have our own anthem. We're not against veterans, as many in our own community have fought for a country that refuses to fight for us. If you are not with Shay Taylor, Andre Bryson, Terrence Crutcher, and the countless other nameless black and brown people who have been abused by the police and hurt by racial inequality, you are not with Kaepernick. And when you kneel in the grass with your slacks before an NFL game, you are not joining our protest. You're simply getting your pants dirty.